I did spend some time at GE, and it was funny to me because there are a couple other folks with some GE background in the audience where the clip is. And Duran was saying, what would happen if Jeff Immelt told the board that he was just going to keep the business flat for several years? And we actually know what the answer to that story is now today. It's no longer there. So look, I am very appreciative of the chance to talk to you all today. I have kind of a funny long-term relationship with Vijay because I met him when I was running GE Inspection Technologies in 2004 in Germany, I think. And then we spent a little bit of time together and I moved on to another job in GE. And about a decade later, I'm here on Long Island in Ronkonkoma, which is not very far away from here. And so I met him back then, and afterwards I moved on to another job in GE, and about 10 years later I'm here in Ronkonkoma. And I'm working in Ronkonkoma from 2010 to 2014. And right at the end, a guy who used to work for me, who was in another division at GE, says, "Oh, you remember Vijay?" And I said, "Oh, yeah, absolutely, I remember Vijay." He goes, "His office is only about a half a mile away from here." And I hadn't known, I hadn't talked to him, I hadn't seen anything. So I called him up, and that was the end of 2014, and now we've gotten a chance to spend a lot of time together. So it's great to be able to be here at the anniversary of his 30th year in business, the beginning of the next 30. So look, unlike many of the speakers here today, my background is not technical, though I have an engineering undergrad. Nobody would pretend that I'm a practicing engineer. But I did have a unique perspective in non-destructive testing in that I got to act not only as an equipment manufacturer, but also as a service provider, as a quasi-asset owner, and as part of an OEM, and saw how NDT was used at every step of that process. And I want to talk a little bit about how that reflects back on growth for the next decades and beyond of NDT. So I'll talk about perspectives from an industry standpoint overall on growth, from a customer standpoint, and then from an investor standpoint, as I'm now part of a private equity fund. So the first one I want to talk about is on industry growth. Some of you or all of you may have seen charts like this, and fundamentally all you really need to look at this chart if you're in the industry and know is that it's rising rapidly. And in fact, every element of the business, every modality that's major, is growing at more than twice global GDP, which is pretty phenomenal. I had looked at charts like this more than a decade ago, and I'm pretty sure they were doing the same thing back then, significantly ahead of GDP. What's just as interesting is that the technologies that are more expensive, more intense, are rising even more rapidly than the commoditized elements of the technology. And this is true in X-ray with computer tomography or digital radiography. It's also true in ultrasound with phased array and advanced phased array. So you've got an industry that's growing and it's mixing up. The more expensive, better equipment is rising within it. You ask yourself, why would that be on a sustained basis? And the answer is obvious. It's because you've got this continuous drive for more, better, faster. And it doesn't matter if it's for quality or for safety, for efficiency. And now, as we'll talk, you've heard all day, and you'll hear in this presentation, more data. On top of that, you've got other drivers about new technical challenges. And those range from being able to deal with a continuous stream of new materials and new processes to the Internet of Things, to artificial intelligence and machine learning, but also into the more basic side of we continue to lose operators, continue to lose experience levels. All these present challenges for NDT for technical development. And then, of course, there's always new industries or growing expanded industries or geographies that are coming out as well. So whether that's the massive onslaught of security over the last decade and a half, food inspection, growth in consumer products testing, or the growth in Asia throughout, all of these represent growth. And so you all sit in or are served by an industry that's growing twice GDP, which is pretty wonderful. So the question that I was thinking about, Vijay asked me to talk, is in that kind of a high growth environment, how do you direct product development? How do you direct the growth of your offering? And what I always come back to is, what's the customer thinking all along the step of the way? And that's where I think the chance that I had to move from different steps in the value chain of NDT, I think offers some interesting perspective. So the first one that I was on was as the general manager president of GE Inspection Technologies. So GE Inspection Technologies, for those of you who don't know, was an acquired business by GE, originally Aircraft Engines, and it was egged for this non-destructive testing business. It had X-ray film, it had ultrasound through Kraut-Kramer, it had X-ray machines, and it's gone on to do CT and so on. We bought eddy current, bought visual, so full range of non-destructive testing technologies. Almost nothing in service, really full stop NDT equipment provider, both inline and in the field. What I took away from that experience is that more often than not, my customer was the NDT department or the NDT operator. And that immediately put them in a situation where their principal focus was on detection, and they were more likely than not to have a fairly high level of experience. And what that meant to me, ultimately, was that our focus from a technology standpoint was defined on detection. And as a result, we spent a lot of time on the fundamentals of the technology and on feature development. All of this existed in a fairly regulated environment. So when I started thinking about that way, and somebody mentioned this earlier, I think the gentleman, Dr. Hanke from Fraunhofer, I walked in and the entire demand setup is all around what is regulatorily required, what are the inspections that are defined at the end of the line, or what are the maintenance inspections that are defined. They're all rigorously defined. There's no opening to it. You can't sort of create left, right, or center. It's all about a defined set of demand. Okay, that's wonderful. I came out of that equipment business and thought, this is fantastic. There are so many applications in the world. We can develop probes for this, specialized expertise here, share application knowledge all over, but it was all about the equipment. After a few years, I moved and I became the general manager of GE Oil and Gas Global Services. So Oil and Gas Global Services puts gas turbines and compressors, high-end gas turbines and compressors, out in the field in oil and gas applications, principally LNG, but we do midstream and downstream as well. And the global services business ultimately has about 1,000 to 1,500 field techs around the world doing maintenance, some level of between parts or repair or change-outs and so on, installations. And I was responsible then for that P&L. What I realized pretty quickly is that all of my focus on outstanding technology, GE Inspection Technologies, ran straight into a fairly inexperienced and fast-growing segment of those 1,500 field technologists. And it was amazing for me. I came out of this time warp in GE Inspection Technologies where everything was about better and better technology. And I realized that when I got the business, I had about 700 field techs, and we had to double it in the space of several years. You simply couldn't get people experienced that quickly. And yet, as a service provider at that level, what's my principal output? I ran the test, and I produced a report. It's going to go through these fallible human beings who are operating at a decentralized basis with this wide range of experience. And ultimately, I want to be able to enable recommendations on asset condition or use with the understanding that the decision that I make or recommend is going to cost a lot of time and a lot of money. So at this point, as a customer, I'm no longer thinking a ton about the technology. I am, but ultimately, once I know I can get detection and I'm looking at a high level of quality on that side, everything is about how I deal first with the people, right? So I want simplicity. Then second, I'm doing a lot of these tests at once, distributed all over the world, and I'm doing them constantly. So efficiency matters. Something that takes 10 minutes to unpack is less valuable to me than something that takes 1 minute. To set up a test that takes 20 minutes versus setting up a test in 2 is huge to me because I'm multiplying it across many, many incidents. So efficiency is a big deal to me. And then finally, data management, because ultimately I'm producing reports. Great, as a service provider. We had another aspect to the same business, which was contractual services. In contractual services, you agree with the asset owner, so Qatar Petroleum, Qatar Gas, to run that asset for them for more than a decade where your revenue stream is fixed and you're paying for all of the expenses. All of a sudden, your perspective shifts pretty dramatically. You're no longer just making money every time something goes wrong. Now you want to minimize the cost to serve while maintaining your uptime promise over a long period of time. So now I'm looking at life cycle operational and financial responsibility on my shoulders. And NDT is clearly a support for that. Great. But NDT is only one data set amongst many. On the turbines and compressors, I've got a ton of sensory data. But someone had said it earlier, it all comes up in silos or subsystems. It's not integrated, and certainly the NDT data was not integrated with it. But my operating decisions are based on a really wide range of data. One piece is technical, one piece is operational, there's another piece that's financial. But it all sits in these silos. And you talked about, last speaker talked about data moving into information, moving into knowledge, moving into wisdom. If you're really going to make really good decisions about an asset and a plant operation, you have to integrate all of that data and come up with a wise decision. It's not just a purely analytical one, particularly not when everything's in silos. So now all of a sudden my focus from NDT is, how do I integrate it with the other data? How do I recognize the patterns out of all of this data? And how do I ultimately make decisions? And I think when you look through all aspects of how NDT is used, what's really striking to me is that, and it may seem perfectly obvious to everybody, we produce information, and the only value of the information is in decision making. And the technical part of producing the data is only one piece. It happens to be an absolutely critical piece, but it is one piece. So what I wanted to do in this is follow along on how that data is used, what it has to be complemented by. Because if you think forward that way, it leads you into understanding how you want to manage your NDT data and what do you want to make easier or harder to use. And if you do need to integrate with data, what do you need to integrate with? Because it's not a random choice. You're thinking about what decisions are going to get made with your core data, and therefore what do I want to attach it to? What kinds of patterns am I looking for? A complementary aspect of this came when I was at GE Aircraft Engines, who's an OEM. And many of you may be familiar with the aircraft or aerospace industry generally, but super high tech, particularly with regard to material science and very demanding specifications. NDT is used in the research, development, and design phase. It's used throughout manufacturing and quality test, and throughout the service, both when there is an aircraft on ground and there's an immediate unplanned problem, as well as in regular service. So it's used all over. Aircraft engines also, the entire business model in the industry, has a highly distributed supply chain. So at the time that I was at Aircraft Engines, you've got so-called revenue sharing partners all over the world. So imagine Fiat sitting in Italy doing a subcomponent for us, or you could be Boeing and have fuselages coming from Japan. Highly distributed. Everybody's got to be thinking about, ultimately, the same quality set fitting together in a final product. But the quality data that is available is trapped in each one of those organizations. So you're trapped in an organization and you're trapped in a system with regard to NDT. But when I'm trying to make a final decision about whether the whole system is going to come together correctly, or whether or not I want to release a shipment from Italy or from Japan to come, which is a difficult decision to reverse, I'd really like to have all of that data sit on a platform where I can look at it side by side across my supply chain. On top of that, I'd love to sit on a platform where I can see the research results and some of the fundamentals about the material science, all the way through design, and every specification and angle from the original computer-aided design, all the way on through looking at a CT scan and comparing it to the original CAD drawing, and being able to tell me throughout the entire system how this data propagated and changed over time and how it fits with all the other data and specifications that I can capture and understand about that system. And of course, the time in any event, I think some of it's being done now. That's really impossible to do, not the least problem of which is that each one of the organizations in the supply chain has its own proprietary issues and does not necessarily want its end consumer, its end customer to know. But ultimately for me, trying to make a decision in aircraft engines, I want to understand the flow of that data. I want to see it in parallel with all the other data that's coming in. And I want to know that I get an integrated decision support answer at the end of the day, which is why I always come back to pattern recognition, because ultimately your decisions, whether you're an expert in the field or you're a system, you're always looking at how the pattern plays out to know whether or not you want to go forward with a particular decision. And so these 4 examples of sitting there looking just at the equipment, just at the service, at the lifetime of the asset, or a total system design are each different aspects of how our information in the NDT industry is used effectively or not. And when I think about product development in our industry, I feel like at the end, you've got to be reaching forward. I think Duran said this morning that, half hour, 45 minutes ago, that one of the key issues going forward is how you integrate technology with people. And it was so clear to me when I moved from just selling equipment to running teams that that interface for the NDT industry is crucial, not just at the operator and tech level, but all the way up to the general manager and CEO. I've got to see how it integrates. So the last perspective that I want to take you through is that of an investor. So I'm currently an operating partner in a private equity fund, and the test inspection and measurement, or test inspection and certification industry is quite hot right now, so we look at a lot of deals in this space. The observation I'd make to you overall about this industry, either as a supplier who's sitting in it or as a customer is being supplied by it, is that from an investment standpoint, it's got quite a few really great advantages. The first is that it's got strong fundamentals that are long-term for growth. When you go back to those first charts on what's driving sustained 2x GDP growth for a long period of time, you say, well, is the world going to want lower quality going forward? Unlikely. Weaker specifications? Unlikely. Longer cycle times? Unlikely. These are really fundamental drivers that NDT enables. So check, long-term fundamental growth. Many defensible technology and application niches. This is why I always love this industry. There is an infinite number of ways to look at the world, pockets where you can gain relative expertise in, build something customized to that pocket, but sitting on a platform layer that's leverageable, and you can go on all day long. As long as you want to work on it, you can find new places to go, and they're defensible. And the third one is that if you're in the service side of the business or lab side of the business, it's got a recurring revenue component. All really, really good, and this is what drives the valuation of TIC, test inspection and certification companies. On the risk side, it's commoditization. The flip side of that technology advantage is if you sit on your laurels, you will get crushed. At the time that I came into GE Inspection Technologies, the business was quite far behind on visual display and phased array. At least in its handhelds, it was quite behind on phased array. And when you get too far behind in this industry, you'll ultimately get crushed and you'll be commoditized. On the labor side, if you don't have anything in particular in the way you deploy labor or in the technology modifications you make to work with your labor, then all you're really going to be doing is renting bodies, and that's a tough game over time. So those are the risks. The opportunities, though, as an investor, are the same ones I saw ultimately at GE Inspection Technologies and why we got into the business to begin with. The first one is around market mapping and proactive market development, meaning having a true map of the applications, the industries, and the geographies where your fundamental technology can apply. So a typical business that we would see from an investment standpoint, there would be an engineer who founded the business, and a typical one would be someone who had grown up in the nuclear industry, was doing NDT, determined a way to do the test with a customized probe in much less time at a higher quality. They leave the company they're working for and they start a probe company, and they are making a ton of money, more than they ever thought in their life, and that is wonderful. You walk in as an investor and you say, well, actually, what you do isn't testing a weld seam in a pressure vessel in nuclear. I know that's what you think you do, but that's just an application of what you do. What you really do is find this particular type of flaw with these particular type of materials in this context. And actually, at that level, I can put it in 20 other applications, and the original application I can put in 5 geographies. When you can draw that map out, you can look at how a fundamental technical insight can have a market that is 5 and 10x what it was originally designed around. The second area is on lean process development for services. Anybody involved in services will probably connect to this. I spend an awful lot of time in lean manufacturing, lean actually, throughout my career. And the penetration of lean in manufacturing today in sophisticated manufacturing operations is very, very high. In services, it's dramatically lower because it's harder to do, but the payoff is significantly higher. So systematizing your service processes is a big opportunity in the industry generally. And the final one I'll talk about is really the buildup of the previous charts on information management, but also so many of the talks that you've heard today, that I look at NDT today and it's in a silo. And to say that NDT is in a silo isn't even fair. Each modality is in a silo, and even that's a little generous. Each application and type is in a silo. And so the opportunity in our world to integrate that data in order to be able to make better decisions and then think about how that information is going to be used as it moves higher and higher in the chain to people who are making broader and broader decisions is a real opportunity for the industry. And so as I look at the future of NDT overall, check on the first one, super strong long-term fundamentals for growth, an expanding range of applications. I think if you're an engineer who loves problem solving, this is an unbelievable industry. You can do it to the end of time and always be doing things that are new and interesting and exciting. I love that about it. And you've got this great new opportunity on data integration and pattern recognition that the entire Industry 4.0 is going to serve up all this opportunity, and somebody is going to take advantage of it. And my final closing thought on all of it is that as you think about where to put your energy in development, think about NDT from an end customer decision-making process standpoint, backward, not just technology forward.